Today's notes are going to be on cells, kind of what a cell is, what makes different types of cells different from each other. This is the first half of Chapter 4, and we will have a second video also with notes from the second half dealing specifically with the structures and what those parts do. But we'll start here with just the basics of cell theory. And cell theory is the combined work of many scientists that figured out one key thing is that every living thing we've found so far is made out of cells. We sometimes say that cells are the structural unit of life, meaning they make up all the structures of living things, everything from the amoeba we see here to the rose. Now those cells themselves differ, but the cell concept is consistent from organism to organism. The second part of the cell theory is that the cell is the smallest unit of life, or we sometimes say the cell is the functional unit of life, meaning that whatever characteristics are for life, we find the same characteristics in cells. So living things perform respiration, cells perform respiration. Living things digest food, cells digest food, and so on. So anything that we think of as a characteristic of an organism should apply also to a cell. And the final part of the cell theory, all cells come from pre-existing cells. I've always found this kind of the weirdest part because if you trace this back, kind of the obvious question is, well, where did the first cell come from? And the answer from the cell theory is we don't know. We don't try to answer that as part of the cell theory. To come up with an answer to that question, that would be part of a different theory. It's actually part of a different field of study where life begins. And we can talk about that later on in the year. But for now, every current cell we have comes from a pre-existing cell, and they came from pre-existing cells, and so on, is our current belief. So those three statements make up the cell theory. Then that kind of leads us to the obvious question of what makes a cell a cell? What is a cell? And one of the key structures, whether it's something like the bacterial cell we have here, or a plant cell, or an animal cell, every cell has a plasma membrane surrounding it, or what often in the past we refer to as a cell membrane. There's no difference between a cell membrane and a plasma membrane. Plasma membrane is the more precise term for the membrane of a cell. But it's the outer layer around each one of these cells. And also inside a cell, every cell either has a nucleus, kind of obvious in something like the animal or plant cells, or what's called a nucleoid region, an area where we find nuclear material, but it's not enclosed like a true nucleus would be. So we see the plasma membrane and some type of nucleus type area in every cell. And then also on the inside of a cell, there always is cytoplasm, and inside that cytoplasm we always find ribosomes. So at the most basic level, that's what a cell is. You kind of have a sac filled with a fluid, and then the key structures being the genetic material of the nucleus or nucleoid, and ribosomes, which are going to be essential to performing some of the key functions of the cell. Now, as far as cell size goes, obviously we all know cells are small. You need a microscope to see pretty much every cell. There are some exceptions, especially some egg cells tend to be on the larger side. Even human egg cells, you can usually just see without a microscope. But the majority of cells you need a microscope for, especially something like bacterial cells. And so we know they're small, but it's not just that they're small, they need to be small. And the reason for that is that small size is important to allow materials to get in and out of the cell and to move to all parts of the cell. Cells rely on diffusion for transport inside them, and if a cell were really large, it would take too long for materials to diffuse from the plasma membrane all the way to the center of the cell. So there really ends up being a limit to how big a cell can be if it's going to perform necessary functions like transport. What we often say is that the size of the cell is restricted by the surface to volume ratio, the ratio between the surface area on the outside of the cell compared to the total volume. If you have very, very small cells, like most cells are, there's not much volume in them, and the tiny surface area is adequate for materials to get in through by diffusion. But if you have a very large cell, there would not be enough surface to allow enough exchange of things like gases or nutrients to get in to provide for all that volume. The problem is, as objects get larger, their surface area increases and their volume increases, but they don't increase at the same rate. As it gets larger, the surface area expands by a square factor, because surface area is a two-dimensional structure, and volume being three-dimensional expands to a power of 3, so it increases more quickly. Basically what this all means is you're never going to get attacked by a giant cell. A humongous cell just really can't exist and function because the cell would die without the needed materials. Okay, now types of cells. One of the two basic types of cells is called a prokaryotic cell, and we can see one here. It's a very simple cell. We can see just a few structures, and those basic structures really are pretty much all we find in prokaryotic cells. And we'll talk about some of the key structures here. The others you may want to look up in your textbook. They have some good information on some things like the capsule and a little bit about the nucleoid in more detail than we're going to talk about here. The mesosome that's actually shown in this diagram is a very interesting story. I'd recommend you look it up, or if you can't find stories on it, ask me in class. It's an interesting story about how science is done and some of the discoveries we make. But as far as prokaryotic cells go, there are only two groups of organisms that have this type of cell. Those are bacteria, or what are sometimes called true bacteria, or even sometimes called eubacteria, and archaeans, or what used to be called the archaebacteria. These are the only two groups that contain prokaryotic cells, and they're considered to be fairly primitive cells. They're primitive enough that the name itself means before the nucleus. Pro means before, and karyo means kernel or nucleus, meaning that we believe these are what cells were like before the nucleus ever evolved in life. So these are some pretty simple life forms that still have hung around and are extremely successful, of course. Now, the key features of a prokaryotic cell is the fact that they don't have membranes internally. So they do have the plasma membrane because they are cells. Remember, all cells have a plasma membrane. But there's no membrane around their nuclear area. There are no membrane structures like you might remember, like the endoplasmic reticulum and vacuoles that we find in other types of cells. There are no internal membranes, so the inside is just it looks just kind of grainy and fuzzy in there, even with really high quality microscopes. They do have those ribosomes that we talked about a while ago that are found in every cell. The ribosomes are just kind of scattered loosely, and they serve the same function that they do in other cells also. Now, eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, are much more complex, and we can see here in this diagram the really great level of intricacy to the internal structures. Things are compartmentalized, things have little membranes surrounding them to keep one part from another. Much more complex than what we saw in the prokaryotic cell. The term eukaryotic, the prefix eu means true, and we already said the karyo refers to the kernel or the nucleus inside a cell. So these are cells that have a true nucleus to them, a nucleus with a membrane. And it's not just the nucleus that has a membrane, there are many other organelles inside that have membranes too. So if you see those internal membranes, it's a eukaryotic cell. And eukaryotic cells are what we find in all animals, all plants, all fungi, and all protists. Anything except for bacteria or archaeans has eukaryotic cells. The easy way to remember, if you've got the two names straight and can't remember which one is which, the one that I always like to say is you have eukaryotic cells. And it's true for all the life forms we're familiar with. These are the types of cells that we come to know and the ones we tend to look at underneath the microscope. And eukaryotic cells, I should say, also are much larger than prokaryotic cells. It's not just a complexity difference, they're a much larger cell. Now, as far as inside a eukaryotic cell, what we're going to do in this lesson today is just do a quick overview of what we find, and then in part 2 of chapter 4, we'll go into a little more detail on the different organelles, with what they do, and some more about the structures of them. But inside the eukaryotic cell, the most obvious feature we see is the nucleus. And in this diagram, we aren't looking at a cell with a nucleus inside, we're looking at just a nucleus here. And you can see inside the nucleus there are other smaller structures. But what the nucleus primarily is a membrane sac So out here on the outside here, we have membranes. And the key purpose of the membranes is so that not just anything can get inside to the DNA, especially things like viruses you want to keep out of there. If a virus gets into your DNA, it can cause some problems. It can cause mutations or things that can permanently be a part of your cell's genetic makeup. So the membranes of the nucleus protect that genetic material, the DNA in there, to make sure that not just everything can get inside. And that's the main feature of the nucleus. Now, also in a eukaryotic cell, you find mitochondria. Mitochondria, over here we can see the very distinctive outer membrane that we see here, but also some inner membranes. And what a mitochondria is primarily known for is cellular respiration. Inside the mitochondria are the enzymes that are required for those reactions of aerobic cellular respiration, the respiration that uses oxygen, kind of like the process that we do in all of our cells. In other words, how you make ATP from some of your food molecules. Then also inside your eukaryotic cells, you have some ribosomes. And some of those ribosomes are scattered like we saw in the prokaryotic cells. Some of the ribosomes are attached to other membranes. So in our diagram here, we're seeing some attached ribosomes as opposed to the free ones that are scattered. And all ribosomes, whether they're in eukaryotic cells or prokaryotic cells, all are involved in synthesizing proteins, making proteins. Proteins are one of the essential molecules of life, so this is a really crucial job in a cell. We also find the endoplasmic reticulum. It's more than just a big phrase. The ER is a very important structure inside your cell, and we do usually write it ER because the name's just too long. The ER modifies proteins. It kind of takes proteins that have been made by the ribosomes and then kind of changes them into a usable form if they're not quite usable yet. And you can see on some of the ER, there are little ribosomes present right on there. Also, some of the ER helps to make some lipids, another molecule that cells require. Also inside your cells, you find Golgi bodies, also sometimes called the Golgi apparatus, or sometimes just the Golgi. And the Golgi bodies, similar to the ER, help to modify some proteins. They also sometimes take proteins that have been produced and can wrap them up in a membrane and get them ready to move from one place in the cell to another, or more often than that, even they will be prepared to move out of the cell. And if the cell is making these proteins on purpose and producing them for some use outside of the cell, we usually call those proteins secretions. So the Golgi bodies are what kind of get those secretions ready to go. And we can see here the membranes, again, they're typical, and these little drops coming off of them are little membrane sacs with secretions inside. We also find inside eukaryotic cells lysosomes. Lysosomes, this is their key job, digest material. That prefix there, lyse, is a term we often use when things are breaking apart, and to digest materials, to break it apart. So these are structures that lyse material in your cell, especially if cells are single-celled organisms and they need to perform digestion. We'll talk more about that in the second half of chapter 4. We find transport vesicles. A vesicle is a name for just a small membrane sac that can carry things around inside the cell. And these transport vesicles may carry material from one organelle to another, or from an organelle to the cell membrane, or from the cell membrane to an organelle. They're basically just to move things around, but yet still keep them compartmentalized. And inside the cell we find what's called the cytoskeleton. The prefix cyto means cell. In fact, this chapter is cytology, the study of cells. Well, the cytoskeleton is kind of like our skeleton in terms of the fact that it gives us the shape and structure that we have, and the cytoskeleton gives the cell its shape and structure. The cytoskeleton also helps with movement, so almost kind of like the muscular system also, and the interaction between the parts of the cytoskeleton can cause the cell to be able to move from one place to another, or change shape, or move things around it. Now, not all cells have all these organelles. Some cells have more specialized structures than others, but here's one we especially see that's not in cells we're most familiar with. If a cell is photosynthetic, like plant cells, it's going to have structures inside called plastids. The most famous plastid definitely is the chloroplast, which we'll talk more about later. But plastids are involved in either making food or in storing food. And you probably all remember that chloroplasts definitely are involved in making food, and that's what's pictured here with this green plastid that we're looking at. And also, inside plant cells, we find a central vacuole, which is a very large storage structure that usually has water and some dissolved ions inside it. And that's going to be important for giving the plant itself some shape and support. And most eukaryotic cells have a cell wall around them. A lot of people think it's only plant cells that do. The truth is, animal cells are unusual in not having a cell wall. We find cell walls in plants, fungi, and many protistans. No animals have them, though. Probably an evolutionary link between us that we somehow evolved from an organism that didn't have cell walls. But we do find it, like I say, in plants, fungi, and protistans. Not always the same, but what cell walls always have in common is it's kind of a rigid structure that doesn't really serve any purpose other than giving shape and support to the cell. It's a non-living structure, just kind of like a box that the cell lives in. So that's our first part of chapter 4. In part 2, we will go into more detail on the organelles, what they look like, some of their structures, and a little more detail on their functions. And remember, if you have questions, please ask them in class. These notes are for you, for your benefit, but there's nothing like being able to ask the questions in person, so come to class, ask the questions about any parts you didn't understand or any parts I went through too quickly. Have a good day.